Hey guys, I'm Jordan Fromer. I believe in hunting hard, hunting smart, and having a fun time while doing it. And shooting limits, well, that's just the icing on the cake. I revel in the journey just as much as the successes it brings. From ducks to dogs to decoys and guns, we'll be talking tactics, strategies, and what it takes to get the job done. Load up and take aim. This is the Duck Gun Podcast. What's going on, folks? Thanks for joining me on another episode of the Duck Gun Podcast. I'm Jordan from Duck Gun Chronicles, and I'm ready for another podcast episode. Today's guest, we have Ben Luukkonen, and he is a PhD student and Michigan State University employee, and he has been doing a study on the decreased population of mallards in the Great Lakes region and a lot of other stuff too. I want to make sure I don't miss anything. They also talk about the hybridization issue as well, which is crazy. I did not know a lot of the information we had on there that he shared with me. Did get to read some of those articles. So I will let you know that it's not great news. So we'll get to that. We'll get him on here in a bit. I did want to mention as well, some of the things you don't think to mention or ask when he was live, but he went to Michigan State University, then he did his master's at Iowa State, then he came back for his PhD at Michigan State University. Did I say that all right? All that right? I think so. Michigan State University to Iowa State University to Michigan State University. So he's definitely well versed and the study. Well, I'll leave that for the main part of the podcast, but let's go ahead and give a big thanks to our partners. So first off, I do want to mention the Patreon group, guys. It is live now, and I fixed the URL so you can search it and all that. It's patreon.com/Duck Chronicles, and super excited. Actually had the first member join for the Elite Ultimate Duck Hunter tier, and I'm super excited for those monthly monthly live chat meetings where we're going to go over all the duck hunting stuff. Super limited, and then I do have the exclusive content for the rest of the Patreon group. Not to mention, we will be continuing on with a hunt giveaway for the Duck Gun Chronicles channel and Duck Gun Podcast for next year. All you got to do is be part of the Patreon, and you'll be entered into that. And I'm super excited about where we're going to go and what we're going to do on that one. So, also, big thanks to our partners over at Onyx, as Onyx is a great solution for the duck hunters, from your mapping to your pinning to finding new locations to hunt. It's been a game changer. I know people say that all the time, but it's literally been a game changer for me. Having that in the palm of my hands, knocking on doors, getting yeses, getting permissions. You do get some no's too. I'm not going to sugarcoat it. You get a lot of no's, probably more no's than yeses, but I've definitely been able to get on more waterfowl because of it over the last few years where I've been avidly using Onyx. So check them out, guys. You won't regret it. Also like to give a big thanks to Final Approach. Guys, Final Approach is the one-stop shop for the duck hunter. They have waders, they have camo, they have decoys, all the awesome gear that you could desire as a duck hunter. One of my favorite things this year was the waterfowl backpack. I used it in a lot of my walk-in hunts. It has a gun caddy where you can attach your gun to the side of the bag. Has tons of storage. You throw it on like a backpack. It's got the hiking strap so you can cinch it down and wear it comfortably on those long hunts. So check them out, guys. FAbrand.com. Alrighty. And continuing on, also like to give a big thanks to Motion Ducks, guys. Motion Ducks is the jerk rig solution. It's a jerk rig on steroids. I went to the low number of ducks, small spread, many times this year. We had many hunts where it was a clear bluebird day, no wind, calm, and we just can't run a big spread in that. The birds are going to notice that something's not right, and they're not going to finish. It just doesn't happen. As many times as I want to try to hunt that way, it just doesn't work. So you got to have motion in your set, and there's nothing better to do that than using the Motion Ducks decoy spreader. So check them out, guys. Use code DuckGun2020 over there and get your discount. Alrighty, let's go ahead and get Ben in here and jump on in today's podcast. Alrighty, fellas, I'm doing the edit for the podcast right now, and I just wanted to mention something, make you guys aware so you kind of understand what's going on. But during the recording of this, Ben's laptop fan kind of comes on. You can hear it buzzing in the background. So thanks for bearing with us on that. Did my best to do whatever I could to the audio. I do think this is a super interesting, super important topic. So even with the less than ideal audio in some spots, I'm going to go ahead and release this podcast. But like I said, without further ado, alrighty, folks, I have Ben on the line here with me. How you doing tonight, Ben? I'm doing great. Definitely excited to have you on here and to talk about some of the research and all that goes on behind it. And the first thought I had when I read it, kind of alarm bells going off. I don't know if I'm overreacting to what I read or if it's more to it, but we'll definitely get to the bottom of it. Maybe not the bottom of it, but we'll definitely have a better idea hearing what you have to say about it. So let's go ahead and start with a little bit of introduction for you. So can you go ahead and introduce yourself somewhat?
Sure. My name is Ben Luukkonen. I'm a PhD student and an employee at Michigan State University, and I'm working on a research project with a big group of partners across the Great Lakes region to learn more about Great Lakes mallards and why the population has declined over the last couple of decades. Awesome.
Definitely, honestly, I'd hope you were doing a research for the opposite reason, but that's not the case. So, a little bit of an unfortunate topic, and one I've kind of wondered myself over the last few years. I hear it from a lot of old timers more than myself. Having been around as long. I got some buddies who've hunted in Michigan for a long time, and to me, it's maybe not as obvious that something has changed compared to them when they've lived through the change. So,
right.
Yeah. So you've got a few articles out there that I've read. You shared some of those over email, and I've seen them in Facebook groups as well. But like I said, a little bit of alarm bells going off on some of those. So let's dive on into it. So go ahead.
Yeah, so maybe a logical place to start is just a little bit of background information on what these different mallard populations are and how they're managed, and what we've seen in terms of mallard numbers. So thinking really broadly at the scale of North America, there are three main mallard stocks or populations. So you have your eastern mallards in the Atlantic flyway. There's mid-continent mallards, which are nesting and primarily using the Mississippi and central flyways. And then there's your western mallards in the Pacific flyway. So when we're talking about Great Lakes mallards, those are mallards that are nesting primarily in Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota. And so they're surveyed every spring with aerial surveys during the breeding season, and they're managed as part of the larger mid-continent population. And historically, both the large mid-continent population and Great Lakes mallards tracked one another. So the changes in those populations mirrored one another, and in the early 2000s, both declined. But after that, mid-continent mallards really increased, and abundance of Great Lakes mallards remained low. And so, for example, in 1998, across Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota, we had an estimated 1.1 million mallards. And by 2019, that was down to 700,000. And so the bottom line is that, state and federal wildlife managers are not really sure why the population has declined, and that's where this research comes in to hopefully answer that question.
So when they're grabbing that data, is that mostly from the aerial surveys that they're conducting to get those numbers?
Yeah, so each state agency, Michigan, Wisconsin, Minnesota's DNRs, each conduct an aerial survey during the spring. So I'm most familiar with Michigan's, but they're all similar and they follow Fish and Wildlife Service protocols. So there's transects that go across the state and they fly fixed wing aircraft really low and count ducks in the transect, and you make some assumptions about ducks you're missing and calculate a correction factor and extrapolate that density across the state to get an estimate of how many breeding birds are in the population.
So by following that same strategy year after year, there should be no reason that data is wrong, as far as the lower number.
Yeah, there's one caveat maybe to mention, and at least anecdotally among agency managers, is there seems to be a shift in the number of mallards that are using urban areas, particularly during the breeding period, but also just throughout the year. And so one of the things to keep in mind is that these aerial surveys are not really designed to count ducks in large cities. You can't really fly a plane low and slow over large cities to count some of these birds. So that's one area that maybe the surveys need to be updated for, and that's one of the things that we're looking at with this study is to see, are these mallards that are using urban areas behaving differently than your typical mallards out in rural wetlands.
Definitely. So that's definitely an interesting point as well. But like you said, it doesn't seem like an easy solution. Whereas like over a wetland, you could just fly a plane. I know that there's certain places that I go, urban areas, where you do see a lot of waterfowl. So it's like, you're going to send somebody to all those areas to count, or it just seems right. Definitely not as intuitive as going out in those wetlands and counting with your aerial survey.
Yep, for sure.
So one topic I wanted to jump on would be the hybridization, and maybe your thoughts on how that plays into the reduction of mallards. So, I guess before we jump into that, is it your opinion that there is actually a large decrease in the mallard population in the Great Lakes region?
Yeah, I don't have any reason not to trust these surveys. They've been statistically designed and they've been conducted the same way, over the course of over 2 decades in the case of Great Lakes, and even longer out in the Prairie Pottle region for the bulk of the mid-continent population. So yeah, I think there's definitely a decrease in the mallard population.
Okay. And then moving on to the hybridization, you want to kind of cut into that one a little bit?
Yeah, so this is maybe going to take quite a bit of explanation and background information. So I think it makes sense to maybe start from the beginning and provide a little bit of historical perspective, and then that'll maybe make our results a little bit easier to understand in terms of what we're seeing now. So if you go way back to before European settlement, in the eastern part of North America, so east of the Mississippi, as best we can tell from early accounts, black ducks were actually the most abundant duck. And after settlers moved in and started clearing the forest, that really opened up things for mallards. Mallards are more adapted to open prairie areas, and that's where they do best. And so mallards really moved into eastern North America then. And at the same time, we had market hunting, and just across the continent, duck populations were declining. And so we got to a point where duck populations were pretty low in the early 1920s. And to kind of combat that, state, federal, and private organizations began to release domestic mallards. And they got these domestic mallards, as best we can tell, primarily from European stocks. So in Europe, mallards are distributed across the entire northern hemisphere. So in Europe, they were a little bit ahead of us, and they domesticated mallards and got I guess you could say, a breed of mallard that they developed for release on these shooting preserves and that sort of thing. And so in the 1920s, primarily in the Atlantic Flyway in eastern North America, these game farm mallards started to be released, and we're not talking just a few; we're talking pretty large numbers. As best we can tell from estimates, in most years there were over 500,000 released annually.
Oh wow!
And this has been going on, now close to 100 years, and so we've had a substantial influx of these domestic game farm mallards, primarily in the Atlantic Flyway, but some were released in the Mississippi Flyway as well. And we're just now beginning to see the consequences of that genetically. In the last few years, some studies by one of our partners at the University of Texas, El Paso, Dr. Phil Lavretsky, was investigating the genetics of black ducks in the Atlantic Flyway and discovered that mallards have these different genetic signatures, and there's been substantial hybridization and integration of these domestic mallard genes with wild mallards, and it's likely creating problems in the Atlantic Flyway where the decline in mallards has been even more substantial than here in the Great Lakes. These game farm mallards were artificially selected, raised in captivity, so they presumably don't have the same survival instincts or migration instincts as wild birds. And in captivity, these game farm mallards don't really incubate nests. They essentially lay a bunch of eggs, which are then collected by the farm managers and put in an incubator, so that they also likely don't have the same nesting and maternal instincts that wild birds do. And so that's one of the things that we're investigating with this study. And so far we found a surprising number of these hybrids in the Mississippi Flyway here in the Great Lakes as well, even though the bulk of these releases have occurred in the Atlantic Flyway. So there's presumably some exchange of genetic information, hybridization and movements of birds between these flyways. Is that all making sense for you so far? You got
definitely,
questions?
yeah, definitely. It doesn't sound great, to be honest. I do have some questions from all that. One of the questions is you kind of talked about from the Mississippi from the Atlantic to the Mississippi. It's kind of spreading westward. Is there a chance that it keeps continuing that trajectory? Kind of, some of Mississippi flyway birds go into the prairie pothole region, breeding. They go down mid-continental, and then it continues westward. Is there a chance of that, or is that more far-fetched that the genes of the farm ducks, the wild farm ducks, is that what you called them?
I prefer to call them game farm mallards.
Okay.
Yep.
That's a little less confusing. Game farm mallards. So is there a chance of that spreading westward?
Yeah, that's certainly a concern, and some of the work by Dr. Lavretsky suggests that the Atlantic Flyway is really kind of the epicenter. So there's widespread introgression there. The Mississippi Flyway and Great Lakes region is kind of an intermediate area, but once you get west of Mississippi River, mallards in the central Pacific flyways, those birds are largely still wild, and that's really the largest breeding population of mallards on the continent. So we are definitely seeing these hybrids moving west, but given the large population size of mid-continent birds, they should be able to at least withstand that for a while. The question is, if this continues on, what are the impacts if we continue to release large numbers of game farm birds?
So if there was some federal law passed today that banned the releasing of the game bird mallards into the wild population, would that be enough to kind of curb this, or is it's kind of like Pandora's box, and once it's open, you can't really put it back in?
Yeah, that's a great question. As best we can tell, it's certainly not too late for mallards west of the Mississippi River, and even in the Great Lakes region, we likely still have enough pure wild mallards in the population that if we stopped releases, we could likely, mallards essentially would themselves breed out those domestic hybrid traits, but that's really, not a certainty in the Atlantic Flyway, where at least in the U.S. portion, you have about a 90% chance of encountering a game farm hybrid. So only about 10% of the birds are wild.
So with their inability to, necessarily survive in the wild and breed, I guess the biggest problem is they're gonna continue to breed with the wild mallards. But essentially, if you stopped it, is there a chance that they would just kind of die off over time? I'm honest, that'd be 90% of the mallard population would be pretty stark if they were all to die off. But it does seem like an issue with not a great solution any way you look at it, especially for the Atlantic Flyway.
Yeah.
So another thing you touched on, they kind of move different. As hunters, a lot of us duck hunters pay pretty close attention to the migration every year. And one thing we're hearing from a lot of southern hunters, especially in some of the places that are the heart of duck hunting traditionally, like Mississippi and Louisiana and Arkansas and those places. One thing they're saying, especially the further south you get, is that they're not getting the same migrations that hunters that have come before them have seen. With these hybrids being part of the flyway, is that possibly a contributing factor to that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that we're looking at with this study. So what we've been doing is capturing mallards and putting miniature GPS transmitters on them in addition to banding them. So those transmitters are a lot like the GPS in your smartphone. They take locations pretty frequently, typically about every 30 minutes, and store them on board. And as long as they have adequate cell coverage, they upload those locations to an online database every day, so I can pretty much monitor what these birds are doing in real time. So we started capturing birds and putting transmitters on in spring of 2021, and we're marking birds across Michigan, Wisconsin, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio. So really broad geographic distribution across all those states, and we're catching mallards in both urban and rural areas. And for all those birds that we mark with transmitters, we take a blood sample, and we send those off to Dr. Lovretsky, and he's able to run an analysis and determine whether those birds are pure wild mallards or if they're a hybrid between a wild and a game farm mallard. And so from all that, we're able to look at relate movements of the birds to their genotype. And what we're finding on a local movement scale so far is that mallards that are about less than about 65% wild. So should back up a little bit. For each bird, we're able to look at what proportion of the bird's genome aligns with a wild mallard or with one of these game farm mallards. And so the birds that are about 65% wild or above are moving around like we would expect wild birds to. But those that are below that level are moving around quite a bit less. They're pretty sedentary, and their daily movement distance on average is about half as much as what they are for wild birds. So we are seeing these game farm mallard hybrids moving less on a local scale. And then on a migratory scale, I think it's a little bit too early to say. And, there we're seeing a lot of individual variation. There's, a lot more that goes into whether or not a bird migrates than just genotype, right? There's weather factors, there's even habitat factors. And so we're seeing a lot of individual variation and, differences in individual decision making. And, one example of that might be, we have a pure wild mallard that decides to spend the winter in an urban area where they might be getting fed by humans. There's probably some thermal benefits of doing so. So it's a little bit more complicated than just genetics in terms of what makes a bird migrate. But I'll say one last thing and get a chance to ask me a question. And it does seem that most of our birds, in fact, none of our birds that we put transmitters on have gone farther south than about the latitude of southern Tennessee. So if you're a duck hunter in the deep south and you like to shoot mallards, it's not a great situation if you're relying on mallards from the Great Lakes to make it that far south. And that's probably a combination of a lot of things, and maybe principally of which has been a changing climate and generally milder winters up here in the north.
Yeah, definitely. That's definitely some interesting data there, and too, that is surprising for me to hear that they haven't been further south than southern Tennessee on the ones that you have GPS tracked. And you said what? It's around 500 that you have?
Yeah. So, like I said, we started in spring of 2021, and we've been marking birds in the spring just prior to breeding, but also during what we call the traditional preseason banding period. So when most ducks get banded is July through August, July through September. And so we're marking mallards during both those time periods. And over the last 2 years, we've marked 435 birds with GPS transmitters across those 5 states.
And have you had a chance yet to see, as far as when they come back, the ones that you've GPS tracked? Like one thing you mentioned too was having milder winters, and two, we've also had drier years here over the recent years. Is there a chance that some of these Great Lake region mallards are nesting further north?
Yeah, it's a really great question. That was one of the hypotheses, one of the things we wanted to look at before we started the study was, one of the ways we could be losing mallards from the Great Lakes is if birds that are hatched here, particularly if hens that are hatched here, if they're leaving to nest in other areas, farther north, like in the Hudson Bay lowlands, for example, or farther north and west out on the prairies. And so that's something that we can definitely look at with these transmitters. And what we're finding so far is that hen mallards have very high fidelity or a very high probability of either staying in or returning to the Great Lakes region. So based on our data so far, I don't think that the issue is that we're losing birds from the Great Lakes that are choosing to nest in other areas.
So if that's the case, that's honestly I don't know if you can call it a bad conclusion. That's not the right wording, but it's not great news to hear that the birds aren't somewhere else. They're just actually no longer here, right? That's the outcome of that. So maybe I've missed it in what you said. Where are those birds? Are they just they're not able to breed well enough? I'll let you continue.
Yeah. So in terms of fidelity, most of the mallards we put transmitters on don't choose to migrate outside of the Great Lakes region. They might go just as far south as they have to find open water and to have ag fields that aren't covered with snow. A lot like you would expect Canada geese to migrate, kind of rather than they're obligated to migrate, they really only migrate if they have to. So most of the mallards we put transmitters on choose to spend the winter in southern Michigan, southern Wisconsin, or in those southern 3 states, Illinois, Indiana, and Ohio. And really it's the minority of our sample that are leaving the Great Lakes region to winter, in areas like the lower Mississippi alluvial valley.
That is something I didn't know. So that's super interesting, honestly. Do they have a guess as to why? I'm assuming that prairie pothole region ducks that breed there migrate all the way down, or is that not the case?
Yeah, there's some other transmitter studies going on down south, including some genetic work by Dr. Lavretsky that suggests that most of the mallards that are wintering in the lower Mississippi Valley are primarily prairie pothole birds. So, from the U.S. and Canadian prairies.
So those ducks, prairie pothole, all the way down to the Gulf Coast, they're migrating all that way out of instinct. And Great Lake ducks just don't migrate the same.
Yes, that's what we're seeing.
That is, And do they believe that hybridization has anything to do with that?
Well, it's really just been in the last few years that, we've identified the relatively large proportion of hybrids. I'm not sure if I mentioned it or not, but, we only have the results from our first year sample, which is 194 birds across the Great Lakes, but 59% were hybrids and only 41% were wild birds. It's really been just in the last few years that we've discovered the widespread, proportion of hybrid birds in the Great Lakes, and so we really don't know yet what contribution genetics has versus what contribution other factors like climate and weather might have.
Okay. Gotcha. I think I'm running you around in circles a little bit, but it's just from my shock on some of these answers you're giving me. So definitely some new information when I thought I had a lot of it figured out. So one thing I did want to touch on, and I haven't paid too close attention to this. Maybe you have, maybe you haven't. But it's within the last decade. A lot of people, similar situation, a lot of fly anglers that were after Great Lake steelhead and other fish in those fisheries were real worried about the stocking practices and having the same thing where it is not great for the gene pool for these fish to act wild and natural and survive. Is that something that has been looked at kind of in parallel with something that seems pretty similar to that?
Yeah, it's a really, really great question. I'm not a fisheries biologist by any means, and I'm just not real familiar with that literature, but generally what I've read and have heard is, anytime you take an animal into captivity and you produce a few generations in captivity and then you release that animal, it's no longer the same thing, So I think there's definitely concerns, not just among anglers, but among universities and agencies as well, that stocking fish could have similar implications in terms of reducing genetic diversity and introducing potentially maladaptive genetic traits in trout and salmon as well.
Gotcha. Yeah, that sounds probably like a pretty fair take on that for sure. Is it too soon to sound the alarm bells, or do we need to wait to the end of your guys' study?
I don't know if we should be sounding the alarm bells quite yet. We definitely want to wait till the end of the study before we draw any final conclusions. We've collected a lot of data so far. We've already accumulated almost 2.5 million GPS locations from the transmitters that we have out. But we're still waiting on the genetic results from this last year's sample, and we're going to be marking another sample of about 100 to 130 birds this year. So we still have a lot of data to collect and analyze. So I definitely don't want to draw any conclusions yet, but I definitely think that managers and duck hunters too should be aware and should be paying attention to this issue of mallard hybridization.
Definitely, and I can say just from the general outtake of it, I am concerned, and I'll definitely be paying attention to kind of what you guys find as the results come in. I think I asked a lot of questions about the Great Lakes region, Is there anything that I missed kind of on the Atlantic flyway side of it, as far as like what I've been paying attention to with the information you're sharing? I'm from Indiana. I hunt Michigan a lot, so that one's kind of that topic is more near and dear to me, the Atlantic flyway. But I know we got a lot of duck hunters out that way. Is there anything I kind of missed on that side of it?
I don't think so. Like I said, the Atlantic flyway, unfortunately for hunters there, is really the epicenter of this hybridization issue because of just the sheer number of hybrids that have been released there. And, it's been going on for about 100 years now, and there are still substantial numbers of game farm birds released. And it's not really highly regulated, and we really just get kind of bits and pieces of the picture. But as best we can tell, there's still every year, 200,000 game farm birds released in the Atlantic flyway. So, if you're hunting mallards there, chances are you're not harvesting pure wild birds. Chances are you're encountering hybrids.
Definitely. Well, this is definitely some great information you kind of passed along. I'll be keeping an eye on it for sure. And, I appreciate you coming on and taking the time to enlighten us on it. I read the articles, but I feel like I, definitely got a lot more information kind of talking to you and asking questions. So it'll be interesting. If the results of your study come back that the releasing of hybrids is bad for our wild duck population, like how feasible is it that duck hunters and managers will be able to convince our lawmakers to pass something to do away with this?
That's a really great question. My role in conducting this study is to identify, what's the problem, how is hybridization a problem? Are there other factors as well that are a concern? And then to develop some recommendations, for state and federal agencies to consider. But it's really up to those agencies, what they choose to do with, the results of the study once we have it. But, I'm a duck hunter myself, and I think one of the roles that duck hunters can play is, as I mentioned, to stay aware of the issue. And it really comes down to kind of what your philosophy is. Do you want to, have duck populations that are wild, and do you want to be harvesting wild birds that, are self-sustaining on their own? Or do you want to be in more of a situation like Europe is in, where it's essentially a put-and-take program for mallards? So I think as duck hunters, we can be aware of the issue, and we can make our voices and our desires heard to the managers. Definitely,
and you can think about not only on that line, but pheasant is a great example of we used to have thriving populations all around the Midwest, and a lot of those have gone to the wayside for one reason or not. The only way I can hunt mallard or hunt pheasants rather in Indiana, I mean, there's rare that you find a wild one, but you can do put and takes, and I can tell you right now, after hunting both, there's a huge difference between those dumb pin raised pheasants and wild birds. So
sure,
that's something, especially as duck hunters, that I'm sure we don't want to see. Don't want to see the fall of a once great population of wild birds. So, alrighty. Well, where can people follow along to kind of stay aware of these? Where will these new findings be released? I don't know if you have like a set place. I know multiple of these articles were from different places. So,
yeah, that's a great question. As we continue to collect more data and get more results, we're going to be developing a plan to share these findings publicly, and it'll probably manifest in either a website and or a social media page. So I'd say stay tuned and look for those. And we're planning to have the final results and conclude the study probably by the summer of 2024. So I'd say check back in around that time, and I should have some concrete findings to share with you.
Awesome. Alrighty, Ben. Well, I appreciate you coming on, sharing this information with us. I'll be staying tuned. You have any, any more articles or anything crazy coming out? I'd be glad to have you back on if you got the time. So, any closing words?
No, that sounds good to me. I really appreciate the opportunity to come on and share more about the research, and hope that waterfowl hunters will find it interesting.
Definitely. Alrighty, folks. I'm Jordan from Duck and Chronicles, and we'll see you guys on the next one.